There has never been a fight that means more to me than beating Stipe Miocic.
Stipe said, and I quote, "I'm gonna beat that ass."
I'm gonna win, there's no question.
This is as anticipated a heavyweight fight as any in UFC history.
I believe that I'm going to not only win this fight against Stipe, but I'm going to finish Stipe Miocic.
I don't see how anyone could think that Jon Jones versus Stipe Miocic would be even remotely close. Let's break it down. Jon Jones is of course coming off a dominant first round submission victory over Ciryl Gane, who was supposed to be a very tough test for Jon Jones.
I thought he was going to lose this fight because I thought the layoff, I thought the move to heavyweight, I thought the last few performances were all going to be a recipe for disaster.
To put this into perspective, this bout was Jon Jones' heavyweight debut against a former interim champion that the previous champion had trouble with in his final defense. It was extremely impressive and quite the testament to the danger that Jon Jones presents to the man he would immediately call out.
Y'all want to see me beat up Stipe?
They're talking about him fighting Jon Jones now, which is be very interesting.
It's no surprise that this would be the fight to make because it is a legacy-defining title fight. Stipe Miocic would be able to add the arguable mixed martial arts GOAT to his already extensive resume, and Jon Jones would get the opportunity to become a defending heavyweight champion opposite the arguable heavyweight GOAT. But the thing about this fight is that I don't think it would be close at all. We just brushed over Jon Jones' most recent performance, and while we're on the topic of most recent fights, Stipe Miocic's last outing was over 2 years ago in his knockout loss to Francis Ngannou. To be fair to Stipe, Francis Ngannou is one of the most terrifying heavyweights ever, and despite leaving the UFC, is arguably still the baddest man on the planet. But recent performances are only one part of the story. Let's talk about their attributes. Both men stand 6'4" tall, but Jon Jones outweighs Stipe Miocic by around 8 pounds, and Jon Jones enjoys a 4-inch reach advantage over Stipe. So even though Jon Jones is historically a light heavyweight, his large frame allows him to actually outsize a seasoned heavyweight in Stipe Miocic, and that reach advantage in particular will play a big part in this fight. I'll get to that when we talk about fighting styles, but first we gotta talk about their resumes. Stipe Miocic has had quite the career with 20 wins and 4 losses. The heavyweight legend holds wins over Mark Hunt,
And there is the stoppage.
Andrei Arlovski,
It's up, it's all over.
Fabricio Verdum,
That's it, it's all over.
Alistair Overeem,
It's all over.
Junior Dos Santos, Francis Ngannou, and Daniel Cormier twice. 5 of those fighters were UFC heavyweight champion at some point in their career, and Stipe finished all of those men except for Francis Ngannou. It's an impressive collection of wins and 3 title defenses, but we can't ignore Stipe's losses. Early in his UFC career, Stipe was finished by another fighter with an 84-inch reach in Stefan Struve.
Miocic is hurt. Struve's gonna finish it here. Miocic somehow staying on his feet. That might do it.
However, the finish was controversial as it stemmed from an eye poke. Good thing we don't have to worry about those, right? That is the only non-champion loss that Stipe has absorbed, as his next loss was a fight of the night decision to former champion Junior Dos Santos. But again, that was in 2014. Stipe's 2 most recent losses were his 2018 knockout loss to Daniel Cormier to lose the title and his knockout loss to Francis Ngannou in 2021. Stipe's victories as well as his defeats are very telling, particularly when we compare them to Jon Jones' record. The man they call Bones has a 27-1-0-1 record. Jon Jones earned his first title shot after his submission victory to future Bellator double champion Ryan Bader in 2011, after which he decimated Pride legend and UFC champion Mauricio Shogun Rua to become the youngest UFC champion ever at 23 years old. Over the next decade, Jon proceeded to dominate his contenders, defeating names like Quinton Rampage Jackson, Lyoto the Dragon Machida, Sugar Rashad Evans, Vitor Belfort, Alexander Gustafsson, Glover Teixeira, and Daniel Cormier. He amassed 11 successful title defenses, but towards the end of his light heavyweight title reign, Jon Jones wasn't himself, almost seeming as if he was playing with his food in his close title defenses to Thiago Santos and Dominic Reyes. The only loss on the man's record is his 2009 disqualification to Matt Hamill for throwing illegal 12-6 elbows, although the fight should have been stopped much earlier and most fans don't even consider this a loss. The no contest on his record is actually his knockout over Daniel Cormier that was overturned due to Jon Jones testing positive for a banned substance. However, many fans consider Jones' first fight with Gustafsson a loss.
You almost won the title against the greatest of all time.
And while I do not personally agree, I do consider Jones' fight opposite Dominic Reyes a loss. But once again, the argument can be made that Jones destroyed Gustafsson in the rematch and that Jones was just bored when he fought Reyes. But regardless, when we analyze these 2 resumes, there are some clear parallels between these 2 fighters. Both men became champions and defended their championships in dominant finishing fashion against some of the best fighters of their eras. However, the key difference is that towards the tail end of both their title reigns in each respective weight weight class, Stipe Miocic was getting finished and Jon Jones was still winning. But resumes on paper can only tell us so much. We all know that styles make fights, and this is where the divide really becomes apparent. When it comes to striking, Stipe Miocic is a very basic fighter. In fact, his entire MMA arsenal is fairly basic. It's not an insult, as a master of basics can easily outperform fighters who have yet to master such basics. He is primarily a boxer and counterpuncher with a vicious 1-2, powerful counter cross and hooks, and great body shots. And despite having decent reach, Stipe prefers to enter the pocket and deliver his finishing techniques at close range. Oftentimes, this occurs when Stipe is on the back foot, pulling his opponents into a tight range where Stipe can counter and deliver more follow-up shots. Stipe tends to pull or push the action towards the cage, because as I said earlier, he likes close range action. And in order to get tighter, Stipe will sometimes throw in a takedown. If he gets the takedown, then he's in top position. If he doesn't, then he can work his tight boxing. You won't see Stipe throwing much of any kicks, and while he does have the capacity for elusive footwork, Stipe tends to just walk forwards or backwards and even tends to square up against the cage to settle his shots even more. However, there are some clear holes in Stipe's game, such as the fact that he is a headhunter with 74% of his strikes being aimed at the head of his opponents. Relentlessly searching for punches to the head leaves him open if he doesn't mix up his techniques. And therein lies the problem, because when Stipe does try to mix in other techniques such as his wrestling, he does so at inopportune times. Take his takedown attempts opposite Daniel Cormier as an example. Timing is everything when you go for a takedown, and despite having respectable wrestling credentials as a D1 NCAA wrestler, Stipe's wrestling is not as impressive as someone else will get to very shortly. In fact, Stipe has only scored one takedown in the last 5 years, that being against Daniel Cormier, and Daniel Cormier took Stipe down twice in their trilogy. Stipe's most impressive wrestling showcases were opposite Francis Ngannou in 2018 and Mark Hunt in 2015, scoring 6 takedowns in each fight. But Francis wasn't well equipped to defend takedowns then, and we saw how the rematch went. And outside of those 2 fights, Stipe hasn't relied on his wrestling to get a victory. Although when Stipe does get a takedown, he tends to have great control and strikes against the cage. However, with 34% takedown accuracy and 68% takedown defense, I'm not sure that wrestling will be much of a positive factor for Stipe against Jones. And in fact, the poor timing he's shown in recent fights might be his downfall. And you may have noticed that I haven't mentioned jiu-jitsu or submission prowess at all. That's because Stipe does not have any submissions on his record, neither as wins nor losses. To my knowledge, Stipe has a purple belt in jiu-jitsu, but hasn't really showcased that skill set in recent years, with the only exception coming to mind being his phenomenal defense of Alistair Overeem's guillotine before finishing him. But perhaps a more telling hole in Stipe's game is not his offense, it is his defense, with Stipe absorbing 3.82 significant strikes per minute compared to Jon Jones absorbing 2.22 significant strikes per minute. On top of that, Stipe has a significant strike defense of 55% compared to Jon Jones at 64%. And this has to do with what I mentioned earlier, how Stipe approaches opponents with his hands down and with square footwork. And by primarily attacking the head, Stipe's opponents can predict his offense to circumvent his defense with their own strikes. So there's Stipe, a fundamentally sound boxer with powerful hands and championship experience. But then we have Jon Jones, a very dynamic striker and mixed martial artist with a vast arsenal. Jon is not afraid to switch stances and fight at different ranges with punches, kicks, elbows, knees, and spinning techniques. I mean, just to show how different these 2 fighters are, you can see how Jon targets different parts of his opponent's bodies compared to Stipe. And not only does Jon attack with a wider breadth of strikes at more targets, but he's also more accurate than Stipe by 5%, and he's more experienced than Stipe striking in the clinch and on the ground. And when it comes to mixing in the wrestling, Jon Jones has not only been more successful at consistently dictating where the fight goes, but he has done so with meaningfully timed purpose. Jon scored multiple takedowns against Glover Teixeira, Daniel Cormier, Anthony Smith, Dominic Reyes, and Ciryl Gane. In fact, the only fighter that Jon Jones did not take down since becoming UFC champion was Thiago Santos. And when the tables turn, Jon has defended 95% of the takedowns that have come his way. And despite also being a purple belt in jiu-jitsu, Jon Jones has successfully acquired 6 submission victories in the octagon, and of course has never been submitted himself. So despite seeming to have a near impossible style for Stipe to beat, I will try to find the weaknesses in Jon's game. I think the first weakness has to do with Jon's pride as a mixed martial artist. It is often said that the only man who can beat Jon Jones is Jon Jones. And this can definitely ring true, as the many times that Jon has found himself in trouble is when he tried to beat a fighter at their own game using their own style. And I do fear that if Jon decides to get in Stipe's face and try to headhunt, he will be on the wrong end of heavyweight power that he has yet to experience, or at the very least get outpointed with crisp boxing. Recall that Dominic Reyes arguably won against Jon Jones, hitting the champion with beautiful combinations from different angles. Stipe isn't the same fighter as Dominic Reyes, but he does have the capacity to read Jones' style and circumvent his defense. I'm also afraid that the very same issue that Stipe faces will harm Jon Jones, predictability. That That's not to say that Jon Jones is more predictable than Stipe, but we have to remember that both these men have phenomenal fight IQs. Look no further than Stipe's body shot adjustments in the Daniel Cormier rematch or Jon Jones' Ciryl Gane performance as examples. And given Stipe's high fight IQ, if Jon does take a more difficult route to victory, Stipe is more comfortable with less dynamic fighters, which could lead to the downfall of Jon Jones. On top of that, we have to remember that Jon Jones has been fighting in the UFC since 2008. He is perhaps one of the most notorious mixed martial artists ever, giving Stipe plenty of footage to download Jones' patterns of attack and defense. So if Stipe does his homework, he can make Jon Jones more predictable because there won't be much he hasn't seen. So we've broken these guys down quite a bit, but before I get to my closing statements, I want to discuss the bridge between these two fighters, Daniel Cormier. Daniel Cormier is of course the man who became light heavyweight champion in Jon Jones' absence, despite losing to Jon Jones on 2 separate occasions and once in spectacular fashion. The rivalry between these two was never close, but DC and Stipe was a different story. Daniel Cormier famously knocked out Stipe Miocic to become a 2-division champion, and in their rematch, Daniel Cormier was arguably winning up until Stipe's 4th round knockout. And of course, Stipe shut out Cormier in their trilogy fight. This shared opponent says a lot about these two fighters. Firstly, to be the only man to defeat an all-time great puts them both in the elite and worthy adversaries to each other. On the other hand, Jon Jones was not in danger against Cormier, whereas for Stipe, outside of the 3rd fight, it was competitive and he got knocked out. And I think this in and of itself perfectly encapsulates the narrative of this fight. Jon Jones poses great danger at all times, and Stipe Miocic poses great danger at all times. The difference is Jon Jones consistently mitigates the danger, whereas Stipe Miocic just imposes his danger earlier than you can. The defense is the deciding factor here. I do believe Stipe has a chance, but that mainly stems from his punching power, not from his footwork or from his variety of strikes. But a knockout is really the only way I see Stipe beating Jon Jones. I can't imagine Stipe getting a submission given the lack of evidence that he can submit fighters at a high level, and that Jon Jones can defend submissions very well. I can't see Stipe scoring a takedown and finishing Jones with ground and pound. Given that Stipe has only been able to implement such a game plan against fighters with poor wrestling, I can't even imagine Stipe outpointing Jones in a straight kickboxing match, given Jon Jones' range and Stipe's tendency to pursue exchanges in the pocket. Or imagine Stipe outpointing Jones through grinding him against the cage with dirty boxing and a wrestling threat, given that Jon has been able to avoid that fate with better grapplers. On the other hand, I see several paths to victory for Jon Jones. Of course, he can outpoint Stipe given his ranged attacks and far more extensive experience in championship fights. I think Jones is well equipped to submit Stipe Miocic with a variety of chokes should the fight go to the ground. And even if Jones can't submit Stipe, he can most definitely control him on the ground long enough to inflict fight-ending damage and ensure a KO or TKO. I don't think Jon will be able to knock out Stipe with a single punch, but with powerful kicks and elbows, I'm sure he can score a knockdown that leads to a finish. I realize this video makes me sound like a Stipe hater, but just to be absolutely clear, I'm a Stipe Miocic fan and I admire the accolades and accomplishments he's gathered during his time in the octagon, and I even love who he is outside of the cage. On the other hand, while I am a huge fan of Jon Jones as a martial artist, his failed drug tests and collection of controversies outside of the cage are things I am not a fan of. But regardless of how I personally feel, the evidence suggests that Jon Jones defeats Stipe Miocic and defeats him in convincing manner. But what do I know? Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Does Stipe have a chance, or do you agree with my assessment? Either way, thanks for watching and I'll catch you in the next one.